So again, please multiple. Okay.
Do I have host privileges yet? Let me see. Okay, so it doesn't look like I have them yet. I wonder if there's a way to ask. So the way that you'll do that is you'll hover over my name and you'll look for more, and there should be an option that's like assign host, assign co-host, something like that. Yay. Okay, so we got it. Let me exit and open again. Oh no, now it's showing me like danger signs. That is not a good way to start a presentation, with danger signs when you try to share your screen. Let me try to exit this and go back.
Well, I don't know. I thought it was that automatically.
Let's see, one participant can share at a time. Are y'all still sharing the be right back sign? I mean, the we'll start shortly sign?
No.
No, we're not sharing anything.
Okay. It's still not letting
I'm
me share.
gonna do a host. I just need to find her presentation. I can share it. I just don't know why I'm not seeing it. Here.
We have your presentation, so one
Okay.
way.
Is it up?
No, just give us a minute.
Okay.
We're working on getting it out. Apologies.
No worries. And a lot of the verbal parts I can do without that. It's just kind of a visual aid, so y'all don't have to stare at me the whole time. But yes, so as y'all are either seeing or will see, the first slide of my presentation reads, "The Future of Motherhood Studies, a Reproductive Justice Informed Mothering Model." And a lot of my work, a lot of my work is in that area. And so with the second slide, we get into kind of like a loose guide of what I hope to achieve, or at least bring up throughout this conversation. The first thing that we're going to do is kind of revisit the historical disparities in mothering. The second thing we're going to do is explore how my journey is influenced by those narratives. The third thing we're going to do is dive into what reproductive justice can teach us about mothering. And then finally, we're going to just kind of loosely daydream about what a RJ informed motherhood movement based on wholeness looks like. Okay, so before we get into that, and for those who are on the other side, I am on the third slide. Before we get into that, I want to make sure that we have a shared working definition on what reproductive justice is. And so reproductive justice is a framework that was developed by Sister Song Women of Color collectives. Really came, although the effort and the practice of what we now consider reproductive justice has existed throughout, the existence of time. The language was really coined more so in the 80s to 90s, and it is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children or not have children, and parent those children within safe and sustainable communities. And so with that in mind, so we're going to pause the slideshow on that screen for a second. And now my own presentation has disappeared. Oh, here it goes. Has disappeared. Okay. So now that we have that shared reproduction of reproductive justice, I'm just going to do a quick caveat that reproductive rights and reproductive justice are not the same. Reproductive rights, as I'm sure most of y'all know, focuses on the legal, securing the right to abortion legally and related services and things. Whereas reproductive justice, as we'll see, is a little bit more holistic in its strategy. And so with those presentation goals in mind, we're going to get into it. I used a little bit of time with the text, so I'm going to talk a little fast, but not too fast. And if it gets too fast, say, slow down, Ambreia, or type it or something like that. But yes, so I was never meant to be here speaking to this group of people about American motherhood. Had the historical perspectives that solidified motherhood in the United States remained in place, I'd be a child bearer, but never a mother. And though the circumstances have changed in notable ways, the narrow, one-dimensional perspective of mothering hasn't shifted that much. The further I get into this work, the more I see myself connected to the stories of Black mothers and childbearers before me. I entered my motherhood journey only partially aware of that legacy and not yet knowing the stories of severed identity and denied maternity that preceded me. But I'd learned those persistent expectations for mothers to give birth with little concern for themselves and their own well-being soon enough. And so we are going to switch to the next slide. There we go. And so before I go a little further, I want to let y'all know that I have these slides that'll have excerpts from things that I have written throughout the years. And so this one right here is going to be really relevant to come in this first set of conversations. Modern gynecology, like many other fields, was established using Black women as lab rats to conduct life-threatening experiments. James Marion Sims, who we know is credited as the father of modern gynecology, began his career as a plantation physician who experimented on enslaved people. In 1845, he began practicing surgical techniques for fistulas on enslaved women without anesthesia of any kind. One of Sims' recorded victims, Lucy, was undressed before an audience of 12 and subjected to extreme agony during and after an hour-long fistula procedure in which he used a sponge and a silk string to recreate a capillary tube. She contacted blood poisoning from the sponge he used to collect her urine, and it took months to heal. Another victim was an enslaved woman named Anarcha, who underwent 30 operations in 4 years, feeling full pain. Not long after, Sims perfected his method and went on to perform fistula procedures on white women with anesthesia. And so that quote is an excerpt that came from a piece that I wrote called "I Know Why Black Women Are Wary of Reproductive Activism." And the way that it relates to this conversation is that sorry, my slides keep doing weird things. The way that it relates to this conversation is that my birth experience is really what pushed me into this work. I like to think that I'd be a person who was curious about motherhood and the sources of it. But having had such a just indescribable experience is what kind of sent me on this path. And so when I think of motherhood, and specifically my introduction, I am reminded of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, 3 enslaved women whose bodies were stolen as the foundation of American gynecology, despite their lack of capacity to give consent. And those centuries have passed between those moments and those incidents that we just read about. Much of the worst parts have remained the same. Like them, during my birth experience, my body felt more like an object than a subject. And one of the ways that best illustrates this is something that I actually learned earlier this year. I was nearly 8 years postpartum when I learned that my provider did a membrane sweep and induced my labor without my knowledge or consent. Up until this year, I thought I had just naturally gone into labor and my body was ready, but I just happened to kind of review those files. And again, that was the lesson that like really shifted for me a lot about how I experienced my motherhood journey. And so from there, the birthing process that followed played out on my physician's terms. The experience was a haze and included unsolicited and non-consensual episiotomy, a subpar pelvic exam that missed and a subpar pelvic exam that missed excessive bleeding as a key sign that something was going wrong. It took over a month and an 800-mile trek to a Texas emergency room to find out that I had retained placenta. Again, years later, I would learn that retained placenta is the same as postpartum hemorrhage, which is one of the leading causes of maternal death within the United States. By then, I'd been breastfeeding, producing little milk, battling postpartum depression, and unaware that my milk supply was low because my body believed it was still pregnant. The pain of that experience forever shaped my birth experience. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so this next slide that we're looking at just kind of gives a little bit more information for y'all about what my experience was like. One of the quintessential moments for me was having gone to the emergency room after maybe about let's see, my son was born in January 30th. So on Valentine's Day, our family had our first outing as a family of 3. And I was in extreme pain and felt something happening while we were celebrating Valentine's Day at a restaurant. And a giant blood clot left my body. Thankfully, the emergency room was right around the corner. We went to the emergency room, and the emergency room physician informed me that passing large blood clots after labor was normal, even when I passed a large blood clot right in front of him. I felt ignored and helpless. As that pain intensified, it was hard to walk from one side of the room to the other. And as we see here, I ended up having an emergency D&C to remove that placenta. And my mom told me much later just how concerned that emergency room physician in another state was that we got there exactly when we did because of what could have happened. But that is not the kicker. The kicker is months later, when my insurance sent me a bill and had sent that to collection because they classified my D&C as an abortion. I felt raped by the system in every way. That they had not listened to my body. And if I hadn't listened to my body, I would have been another maternal mortality headline. And so thinking about how I entered this experience, extremely mindful of how the legal ramifications, expectations, limitations around abortion and other types of reproductive health care literally required a bill to be sent to collection for me because our connection between birth and motherhood, between abortion and narratives on mothering and motherhood. And so that experience and another experience that we'll get into a little bit later were really important in the work I decided to do about not only highlighting the disparities of mothering and motherhood as across race, but also just wanting to ensure other people that, wait, these are the signs that something is happening even when someone denies you, because I needed that for myself. And so despite all of that pain, I played the role. I tried to be a good mother, as whatever that means. That's, y'all can't see it, but well, y'all can now. It's in quotes. I was like, wait, they can see me. But yes, so I tried to show up in the good mother role anyway. And looking back, I know that my efforts were twofold. The first reason was I wanted to give my son the best of the world, and the internalized message, and I had internalized the message that perfection was the only way to make that happen, specifically when you're raising Black children in the United States. The second reason, which it would be a long time before I felt comfortable saying out loud, is that in my heart of hearts, I believed that if I did parent perfectly, I would be able to exonerate myself from the termination that I had had in high school. And so for me, having that bill be sent to collection and that financial consequence of the word abortion, of the word termination, however we want to phrase it, it felt like a reminder that I had started my journey the wrong way by exercising choice. And so in everything that I did and in everything I wrote, I was constantly curious, is there something that I did to make this circumstance happen? Is it punishment for not having carried that high school pregnancy to term or something like that? And I, of course, worked through a lot of that, but that's not the story we're telling, but it is relevant to this. Okay, so later I'd learned I had nothing to prove to the world about my caretaking capacity. And instead, the world had multiple centuries of denials and failures to make things right with me. I knew something was wrong about the way I was experiencing motherhood, but I assumed that it was me and how I chose to adapt. My journey and desire to solidify agency and autonomy in motherhood was just beginning. And shortly after my first child, I would make the decision to return to school. But before I got back to school, years had passed and the trauma of my birth experience didn't leave me and it also forever shaped the way that I would experience the American medical system. For me, I couldn't understand, if I lacked the capacity to advocate for myself in birth, how I would ever have the capacity to advocate for myself in motherhood. I saw those two experiences as just fated and forever intertwined. And I carried a lot of stress and shame that even though my son turned out fine, that I was focused on my traumas instead of his. And so I needed to understand, like, not only the experience of like developing and preserving agency in motherhood, but I also needed to have a better sense of how we got to the position we were at. And so I turned those experiences into stories for national and international publications. And I got to work highlighting health disparities and the denial of experience that accompanies mothering while marginalized. And so we can go, oh, give me just a second. Okay, so I wanted to dive deeper into the why, and I entered school wanting to investigate the reproductive experiences that I'd create that had led to my career. But I also at that stage didn't know anyone else who was talking about motherhood in the way that I was discussing motherhood. And there were two particular experiences that stuck out to me and kind of described the discomfort and the frustration that I felt on my mothering journey. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so the first discomfort that I had showed up when I was celebrating my first Black Breastfeeding Week, and which takes place in August, the last week of August, and basically exists to acknowledge the struggles and the disparities in breastfeeding rates in Black communities. And so within that experience, I ended up going like bad viral in the sense that what I thought would have been a conflict-free post turned into an opportunity for a lot of angry white women to be like, why do you need this? And y'all can see, I can't see it on my side because of where I am, but y'all can kind of see how those are some of the comments. I ended up turning it into an article. I turned everything into an article. And it just kind of highlights some of the feedback and perception and the response that that others had to me making a post about Black Breastfeeding Week. And so for me, that gave me one thing that made me feel off in my mothering experience, and that was the denial of difference or invisibilization. So the reason I describe it that way is because here I am having this particular culturally backed struggle or desire to kind of find my way or see myself in a narrative. And the response is angry and uncomfortable and invalidating and all of these other kind of things, which again leads you to silence yourself, prevents others from seeing themselves as well, and leads to invisibilization. The second thing that was a key theme in my motherhood journey in those early years, and I don't have a screenshot of this one because you don't want to go to the Washington Post comment section more than once. But it was the assertion of abnormality or demonization. And the reason that I decided to phrase that way is because this particular story was one where I was talking about raising children who were young, gifted, and Black. We have a household of neurodivergent folks in our family. We're just all over the place in some of the best and some of the most challenging ways. And so the article is probably one of my favorite articles to date. And overwhelmingly, the comments were positive. But one type of comment that I saw more than once in the section were people saying things like, yeah, her children are great, but did you notice she didn't mention a father? Or, oh, it sure is good that they know how to read, but is a dad around? And had they actually taken the time to read the article, they would know I just happened to be married. But it's like when you can't find something wrong with the story, you insert yourself and make a decision to call on those historical scripts for not just Black populations, but for any population, that it's like, okay, well, you might be good, but I got you. And I'm sure in different opportunities, a lot of y'all have experienced that in your own way. And so next slide, please. And so for me, that experience was reflective of like one of my favorite theories in the world, developed by Melissa Harris Perry, and it's referred to as the crooked room theory. And so to introduce that theory, I say, for most of my life, I've been in a constant state of discomfort. I discovered racial consciousness at a young age, what most folks described as having an old soul and being wise for one age was the result of me maturing faster due to trauma. Seeing the world play out as a powerless child left me in a near constant state of terror. My childhood was filled with with headaches and nervous stomachs. And when I got older, the older I got, the clearer it became that I was standing up in what Melissa Harris Perry described as the crooked room, and it wouldn't be easy. Next slide, please. According to Harris Perry, the crooked room is a way of describing the difficulties Black women face while trying to develop a sense of self in a world where stereotypes, namely the Jezebel, the Sapphire, and the Mammy, derail authentic expression and presentation. The struggle to stand was never harder than when I became a mother. My story is eerily similar to countless Black women. I was vibrant and educated, wanting to expect the best from the healthcare system, only to be severely disappointed. Prenatal care and delivery changed me. Initially, I was an occasionally timid, self-confident young woman who happened to be Black. I believe the medical system was there to improve my well-being and extend the number of years I have on this earth. I also falsely believed that money, marriage, and education could transform me into someone the world respects. And so those comments, particularly the comments that are like, but where's the dad? Do her kids have a dad? Because we're kind of private about our family. Just kind of reminded me that no matter how much effort I place into kind of checking the boxes of respectability, those historical scripts were always there waiting to try to shift and tilt the room so I could no longer stand up correctly. Because one of my favorite things about the crooked room theory is to just kind of give y'all a visual image. Y'all are sitting in that room now, and just like imagine if someone like tilted it 25 degrees off the axis, your chair would be sliding, your materials would fall off of the desk, the tech cords would probably be too short, and you would spend as much time as possible trying to adjust, but eventually you'd be like, am I crazy? Like, why can't my power cord reach the wall? Like, why is my stuff sliding off the floor? And like, imagine if I came in and I was like, well, I'm in Wyoming and my stuff is right. So I don't know what's wrong with y'all crazy people out there in Boston, but you should get that together. And just kind of using that as an example or a metaphor is why, well, it isn't, you know what I mean? But anyway, just kind of giving a more illustrative example. It's one of the reasons that I just love that theory, because it's so easy to imagine and connect with that. And I think that it's something that for different reasons, all of us can connect with. And so again, knowing these, I was actually introduced to Melissa Harris Perry's crooked room theory in undergraduate, and I hadn't revisited for a long time until I was a mother. But when I came back to that language, I was like, I need to go back to school. So I needed to dive deeper into the why. I entered school to investigate the reproductive experiences that I'd created a career exploring, but I didn't know anyone else who felt motherhood was important to study. The larger world and the lack of support I witnessed in my journey suggested that motherhood was something you did when you weren't capable of anything else, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew that there was a collection of experiences, sets of knowledge, survival skills, and everything that was required to raise children in this world, in this time. And I wanted to dig further into that. I ended up reading literature about how systems of oppression limited mothers across ethnicity and culture. And I hadn't expected that the only way I could make sense of my experience was to know what I was up against by reading our stories and conversation with each other. And so, of course, like, I'm sure y'all can guess some of the stuff that I learned in school, because we all have a shared academic interest. So I won't go too far into that. But one of the things that I do want to say, in case there are any other American Studies majors out there, is that I had the privilege and the disadvantage of creating my own curriculum, because American Studies, as y'all know, is very loosey-goosey in the best ways. And so in the process of developing that curriculum and just kind of being on this journey and watching my thesis evolve, I was fortunate enough to come across Dr. Andrea O'Reilly's work and just kind of see that there was a discipline that was exploring the things that I was exploring, but it was a little bit different. So when I was studying American studies, I did notice that Black and Brown narratives were often foundational in the discussion. And I really appreciated that, being exposed to Patricia Hill Collins, who we'll talk about later, and getting the opportunity to read through those books. But I also noticed that the conversation was rarely modern and today, and it was very rarely front and center in conversations of motherhood. And so for me, as someone who came from the public and was a young Black mother in Wyoming, motherhood studies felt incomplete and sometimes inaccessible. I learned that everything that made white motherhood both special and a site of struggle was developed in juxtaposition to the narratives of racism and misogynoir. And I also realized that mothers from my community did not have time or energy to engage or pontificate about the theory of motherhood. Again, they were wading through the daily trials of parenting and drowning in everyday responsibilities. I wondered how we could bridge the gap between what we think and theorize about motherhood and the practice of mothering, particularly in a racialized body. And I remembered that reproductive justice could fit into the picture. When I encountered Adrienne Rich's institution of motherhood, I felt just incredibly excited. I was like, institution versus practice. That would explain why I felt so trapped and limited in this process at times. And I enjoyed how books like Killing the Black Body by Dorothy E. Roberts and Reproductive Injustice pointed out an inconvenient truth. Black voices, I enjoyed learning those things and witnessed that Black voices continue to be excluded from perspectives on mothering despite having forcibly mothered others for centuries. But it wasn't all bad. Black feminist thought by Patricia Hill Collins introduced me to Black mothering traditions and let me know that we have always practiced non-normative mothering. Hill Collins spoke of a Black women's standpoint on mothering that diverged from scripts of perfection, affluence, or individualism, and it rejected this idea of perfect motherhood because they knew from the start that it was based on a standard that did not apply to us. Instead, Black families were organized around creativity, mutual aid, and growth. I learned that Black motherhood was resistance and love, and of course, sometimes hard truths, in an anti-Black world that sought to eradicate us. But one thing that really stuck out to me is that we would do whatever it took to push our children closer to freedom, even if it left us behind. And I learned that there was a similar thread of resistance in Chicana, Asian, and Indigenous mothering models, and also for other mothers of other. Hill Collins' words taught me that mainstream scripts of motherhood ignore the complex stressors faced by Black mothers and families. Often, dominant structures took this violence a step further by lying, saying that if we were perfect, we could buffer our children from anti-Blackness and the violence of the world. Yet somehow, as we heard in that as we heard in the story I referenced about the person saying, but is there a dad though? There was a failure to acknowledge the double standard and how a lot of folks are just sitting around waiting to demonize Black mothers as unfit. For non-normative mothers to thrive, we have to acknowledge the horrors that limits access, ability, and agency. And again, all of those are key areas of focus within reproductive justice. Next slide, please. So one of the most exciting moments, probably the second most exciting, not the first, one of the second most exciting experiences for me on this journey was learning about intensive mothering and realizing that that sentiment was everywhere and very visible in well-meaning parenting models, including gentle parenting, which is very common right now. And that is not to say that gentle parenting is not valuable and that I don't practice many of those tenets today. But there's also an importance to acknowledge that expecting mothers to be present and well-regulated in a dysregulating world is setting individuals up for failure. Because of that, I realized we weren't just failing marginalized mothers, We were failing all of us, namely because many of these models downplay the importance of the village and prevent children from having multiple sources of nourishment. And so to go over to the slide, of course, we know this ideology came into prominence in the 80s and the 90s and is characterized by high sacrifice and material resources for children and low leisure and time for mothers. It is very clear how intensive mothering is connected to larger expectations of individualism. The part that stuck out me most is that intensive mothering normalizes the lack of support that we experience as American families and the lack of healthcare access, the lack of parental leave. And of course, it intertwines and conflates with quality mothering intertwines and conflates quality mothering with class and to a notable degree race. Intensive mothering, as we know, requires that you live your life for your children and not yourself. And if you won't or can't do this, even because of hardship, there must be something wrong with you. And so I spent a lot of time in my mothering journey curious if there was something wrong with me and how I entered this journey. Because again, even with those initial traumas, my question was, am I the failure for not only having experienced the disadvantage or not having possibly articulated something correctly or not having read the right books, but also for what could be called selfishness, but what in reality is a desire to preserve the self, right? As we know, mothers are continuously demonized and looked down on and spoken negatively to just for a desire to preserve the self on a mothering journey. And so learning about intensive mothering, I told y'all that was my second favorite lesson. Now we're about to talk about my first and most favorite lesson. Next slide, please. And so I found the most important mothering lesson that would apply to me as a Black mother when I came across Parte Sequitur Ventrum, which I actually had an opportunity to hear a presentation that brought this up. So yay, conversation is happening in multiple places at once. And the loose translation of the status of the child follows the mother. But I remember coming across that language and feeling like this big monumentous occasion had just taken place, and I had learned the answer to a question that I had known to ask. For me, Parte Sequitur Ventrum and the revelations attached to it became a through line, equally past and present, that let me know that I had encountered one of the most crucial lessons of my life. And to just kind of elaborate a little bit more, Parte Sequitur Ventrum is a 17th century English legal principle that pretty much describes the system that was created to justify the enslavement that designated Black women as incubators, but never mothers. The perspective solidified motherhood as a privilege for the free and the white. It designated Black children as waiting in a queue as human free property before they were born. And it also connected to another kind of theoretical framework developed by Orlando Patterson called social death, which describes this loss of identity and humanity that enslaved people experience. That connected with me as well. I knew that all mothers were vulnerable to some degree of social death, this idea that you're going to lose your identity and your humanity because of the social group that you belong to. But I also noticed that for many Black mothers, there wasn't an opportunity to have the agency to notice a difference. And for me, this showed up in negative healthcare experiences, seeing higher rates of abuse within my community, being aware of the injustice in criminal justice, and just being aware of like general stereotyping and mistreatment. Intensive mothering said that I was responsible regardless of my struggles, but Parte Sequitur Ventrum suggested that as a Black mother, my children's legacies were interwoven with the struggles and overwhelm of my own. And so next, of course, we take those lessons and think about those larger institutional and structural barriers, and we get into just a reproductive justice-based mothering. I want to let y'all know, if it isn't already clear, that I do not believe I have all the answers. but I do believe that I have an excellent ability to ask questions and connect with the why of truths that others take for granted. The reproductive justice leaders and movement have been instrumental in the questions that I've learned to ask. Again, for those who don't know, Sister Song defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children or not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. That was the missing layer from my story and how I wanted to craft my motherhood. My passion for reproductive justice came from a desire to escape the shame of having had an abortion as a teenager, but it also came from a desire to preserve my sense of self and see myself as whole after having children. I had been raised, or really not even raised, I had just witnessed socially that good mothers didn't have abortions, this false binary and dichotomy that we see in life, and there weren't enough talks about the circumstances, the structural factors, the environments that leave many of us in the position, specifically at a young age, where we have to make those sorts of decisions. And so, of course, we know the truth is that many mothers choose abortions to save their lives or to ensure they have the capacity for their earthside children to be taken care of. And reproductive justice looks at the structural and the communal gaps that leave all, especially Black and Brown communities, vulnerable. It reminded me that I've been a whole human with needs since childhood, even when the world seeks to fragment and compartmentalize who we are, especially in motherhood. I realized that motherhood that isn't rooted in reproductive justice leaves all of us battling to appear most sacrificial in an unsupportive world. I couldn't see myself in mainstream conversations about race and gender. I wanted to process how social perceptions and politics affected my personal experiences, and reproductive justice and that framework gave me the language to communicate why it was not only important to preserve access to abortion, but also to ensure that we have trauma-free birthing experiences and how those topics were interrelated. It gave me the language of reproductive oppression to learn how historically this removal of our bodily autonomy has showed up and not only impacted our individual stories, but very strongly shaped our experiences in motherhood and mothering. And so for me, reproductive justice illuminated the natural parallels between an early stage patriarchal capitalist system, which designated Black women as dual sites of production who were expected to subsidize society with labor and their wombs, and the system today that continues to exploit Black women and other people. Like then, the role of Black parents is devalued, and while the source of the systemic violence separating families of color has transformed from immigration policies to foster care, incarceration, police violence, and extraction and exploitation remain the same, we haven't spent enough time discussing how these things are connected. An adequate reproductive justice framework goes beyond breaking down the anti and pro-choice binary, and it means that we have a conversation that looks beyond birth and explores how the institutions create co-vulnerabilities and what abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls a risk for premature death that continues after birth. It requires challenging an immigration system that traumatizes families in overt and covert ways, and it asserts that all people deserve access to quality healthcare and healthcare experiences, education, and family leave policies, regardless of race, orientation, gender identity, and citizenship status. It also means taking an issue with a culture that demands that we give birth at all costs and instead replace those expectations with true pro-community policies. And lastly, it requires proclaiming that there is no such thing as choice until Black and other mothers of other can choose to mother or not without the weight of multi-generational systemic racism influencing their decision. Reproductive justice reminded me that my struggles in mothering and motherhood were so much bigger than the general mainstream conversations I was seeing on mothering. And I realized that if I blended my awareness and my efforts, I could create something new. I hadn't failed, I was failed, and I had other options. Next slide, please. And so this slide pretty much goes through my journey and my experience of just realizing that I did have the opportunity to recraft a version of motherhood that felt better for me and that wasn't weighted in historical pains and traumas, but instead kind of took more of like a post-traumatic growth framework. And so for time, I'm not going to read all of this, but I am going to read the last sentence. I revisited the claim that the child status follows the mother, and I realized I couldn't raise free Black children who felt their full humanity unless I modeled freedom for myself. And so, of course, the question is, what does reproductive justice look like combined with motherhood today? And I would suggest that it looks like pursuing wholeness in motherhood. It looks like learning to not only like experience, but also actively be able to call out the scripts on motherhood and mothering and this good, bad binary, this fit, unfit binary, and these other things that oversimplify the healing process that is required to raise children with intention. A reproductive justice anchored motherhood is rooted in agency and should remind all of us that our need for support did not end after pregnancy or when we gave birth. It continues through the lifespan. And for me, reproductive justice provided a sense of shared destiny that I hadn't seen in other movements. It guided me with what I wanted for my children and the other mothers in my life. I created Free Black Motherhood, a movement that seeks to humanize Black mothers and others on our parenting journey and beyond. But there are some components of this that are non-negotiable. Next slide, please. And so, again, because of time, I'll be kind of brief with these next 3 slides. The first thing for me that is a non-negotiable in a reproductive justice informed mothering model is being able to name the systems that impact dialogue and the practice of motherhood. And so that means knowing how expectations of capitalism and performance and excellence and all of these other buzzwords that are common right now don't just show up in our workplace. They infiltrate our families, our parenting models, and they uplift us at the cost of our pain and the cost of devaluing the fathers, non-birthing parents, and other caregivers in our life, leaving us to raise children who are expected to be seen and not heard and not prepared to thrive in a healed and authentic-based society. Next slide, please. The second non-negotiable for me is learning the importance of mothering both in love and community. And so I had the opportunity to write a piece on just kind of looking at motherhood as a site of resistance. And again, I'm sorry, I don't have the time to read this whole thing, but the part that's most important here is kind of reinterpreting the way we use the word mother and not just thinking about the language of like mothering as a verb, the practice we're already doing, but acknowledging that we can also think of the word mother as a reminder that we need to be mothered. And it is possible for someone to show up for and hold and care for us in the same way that we are expected to show up for, hold, and care for our children. Next slide, please. And sorry, y'all, if I'm going too fast. And the final non-negotiable for me in this conversation is embracing reflection and healing. Again, I prioritize myself on asking questions, even if I don't find answers. It's the type 4 in me. My Free Black Motherhood effort just kind of works from this idea that we have the opportunity to invest in ourselves, and it is necessary to heal before we can show up as the parents we want to be. For me, it is an effort that continues to try to take components of reproductive justice, bridge the, there's my timer. That's why I knew I was going to. So take the efforts to bridge the academic and the lay and go from theory to actual practice, right? Like putting our theories into practice and getting the things that we need done and understanding that there are no experts. We learn from each other in our experiences and our joys. And let me see, that might be, does this say, is that slide number 14?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we can sit there for a second. And so as mothers and mothering people, I believe that we deserve the freedom to explore frameworks in whatever way connects with us. And so the way that I am offering this to you may not be directly reflective of your community or your lived experience or what you're looking for your community. But again, you have the opportunity to recraft it. For me, this looks like sharing stories about the mental, social, physical, and institutional barriers that limit Black mothers' ability to show up as dynamic human beings, and continuing to shine light on that crooked room. It also requires not just looking at the historical narratives that limit us, but also knowing and encouraging Black mothers and others to be healed and held. And so last slide, please, or next slide, please. Yeah, I think it's last. And so another component of my work is encouraging Black mothers and others to share stories and reflect on the narratives that precede and follow us, so we can break the cycles of the strong Black woman and mother, or just the strong mother generally, and similar sacrificial models that remove our ability to self-define. And so, of course, in wrapping up, the question becomes, where do we go from here? Well, that's up to us. There are 3 main points that I have kind of like came up that I have kind of summarized that are most important to me, but the ones that are most important to you could be different. The first is that in the same way, just right in line with the reproductive justice framework, motherhood should be a choice in the time, a choice in the way, a choice with the who. We deserve all of those components. And if we are not starting with that baseline, we're already in a rough spot. The second is we need to be, from my perspective, we need to be better integrating our experiences pre-birth and post-motherhood. And for me, that involves not just spending more time looking at how traumatic births and pre-pregnancy experiences have led to great traumas, but how do those show up in our mothering and motherhood every day? How do they show up, the things we expect, the things we encourage, the things we offer to the next generation? And finally, that piece of self-definition, which connects to what reproductive justice refers to as self-determination, the ability to make our own decisions about who we are and how we'd like to show up in motherhood and mothering, and to remain fluid in our mothering practices. And don't feel the need to label yourself to one type, but just show up as whatever works for you in that age and stage. And so that was a lot of fast talking. I had more stuff, but we will wrap up there if it works for y'all, to be mindful of everyone's time.
Thank you so much. I hope that you can understand why we chose Ambreia for our final guest speaker in so many ways, but particularly for a conference that's made mothering and motherhood past, present, and future. I love your optimism and the ideas that you have for moving forward, but I'm sure other people have questions that I wanted to hand off because we only have about 5 or so minutes. So, questions? Everyone's in the chat. Maria, please comment. Okay, one question. Yeah, many people are saying brilliant work, brilliant keynote, plenty to think about and take action. Thank you so much. So many great quotes. I think we're all letting all the insightfulness that you've shared with us sort of seep in a little bit.
Yeah. I have a comment. I just really appreciate how you bring in Loretta Ross's work, and her work has come up in multiple sessions that I've been in at this conference, and so it was really kind of nice to end on this note, and I just very cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for shouting out the 4 mothers by name. As you just heard, Loretta Ross is firm and foundational in that work. And there are more of them. So I was like, if I can't name all the mothers, I'm gonna name the organization, but not the individuals. And if anyone is interested in that, I can get that information to y'all.
So we have 2 on the chat.
Okay, we have 1 in person,
Okay.
and then we're gonna go to 2 in the chat. I have a question that could probably take you about 20 minutes to finish, so I'm probably gonna hold on to my question, talk to you about it later. No, feel free.
I'm waiting for my thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit. What I'm excited about what you're doing is that you're bringing motherhood and reproductive justice, like other issues later about motherhood, not just birthing, right? Like, and so could you speak about that a little bit, like how understanding mothering as part of reproductive justice?
Yes. Thank you for that question. And just for the sake of a somewhat concise answer, one of the reasons I take that approach is because we're always looking for opportunities to fragment and compartmentalize, right? And so I know that at least what we tell ourselves, whether true or not, is we do that for efficiency. But you cannot thoroughly support people in their reproductive experiences, in their individual experiences, in their healthcare experiences, without taking the time to have a whole and dynamic understanding of that person as a person, you know? And so for me, being mindful about our status as mothers and caregivers is instrumental to understanding like capacity, struggles, how we show up in different spheres of our lives. And I will leave it there out of thoughtfulness. But if you want to talk about this more, any of y'all can reach me offline. I love to just run my mouth about this stuff.
So just really quickly, I think that some of us heard you saying other mothers of other.
Oh, yes. Yes.
You didn't know for sure what that, it's just new. I think it's a new one.
No, it's funny. So again, I'm a writer, so I like words. And instead of saying marginalized mothers, in that opportunity, it felt like a chance, and I think I made this up. I may not have. If y'all hear someone say, Ambreia's lying, she did not make that up. It was not intentional. But y'all see I'm silly. But so when I say mothers of other, or I say other mothers of other, I am referencing the fact that there are individuals who they themselves may not be considered marginalized mothers, but their children are considered other in this society. Is that a little bit more clear? So it's like taking this idea of having been otherized. And so if you are a mother of other, then again, you will share some of those same anticipations and concerns, even though you have not necessarily gone through those structural barriers.
Are there any other questions? So one of the questions that I have, and this is something that came up at a recent conference that I attended, was the role of the state. And where do you see the role of the state in terms of some of the, I wouldn't say utopian, but sort of you outline some personal goals for yourself, but they're also attacking or trying to address systemic injustice. And so if you're not moving through the state, where do you see sort of the best and most fruitful ways forward?
Well, that is a very hard question to say for the amount of time we have. But the kind of like the top of mind answer, if there's a such thing for this, is yes, we are all in a position where it feels that, and it's not unique in the history of humanity, that we don't necessarily feel like the powers that be have our best interest in mind. And what I have witnessed, and although I consider myself an advocate, not necessarily an activist because of the work that I do, is showing up for each other and skill sharing and learning these practices and having like these informal kinship networks turns out to be really important, not only in like mothering mothers, but also showing up for each other. And some literature that I am very early in, so I won't speak in exploring, so I won't speak too much about it because I don't want to misspeak, is this conversation that's actually happening around, like, of course, not only taking it where Adrienne Rich went about the issues of the nuclear family, but also having a conversation about just destructing the nuclear family and how this idea of blood shared, blood-related kinship is actually the barrier to connection of others. And that is not something, again, that I'm deep enough in to elaborate on at this moment, but for individuals who that is an area of curiosity, and if you're more into like fictive kin or other family or a chosen family, thinking about like queer systems of family and belonging, that could be a really cool area for someone else to study. Y'all laughing at the someone else?
And that, and we have another conference next year, so that offered a great segue. Thank you so much, Ambreia. Another round of applause. Now I want to keep you, I know we're all anxious to get on with our days, but I want to give a huge, huge thank you to Jenny for all of the round of applause for the board who has done so much of the heavy lifting. Thank you so much. So enjoy your evening. I hope if you are doing a dinner meeting greet, you know how to contact one another. If not, famous words, email me. I as soon as I can. Stay in touch. It was so nice meeting you.
We forgot to invite her.
All right, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.